Well, hello again, friends. We are continuing. We have a new series, which is really kind of an aspect of the adventures in identification. I'm calling this series Simultaneity and Sequence. And I talked about their relationship to the planet Uranus and to the planet Saturn, respectively. So we had just finished a kind of little introduction to the background. I guess I'm offering a few little anecdotes along the way and some examples of personal experience and personal history. So in some cases, this is all a little bit autobiographical, if I can be allowed, and hopefully you do not find it a distraction. I could be completely and utterly rigorous in my approach and leave out those moments of spontaneous, relaxed commentary, but I've decided to do it in a bit more informal manner. Now, we were just beginning with the secret doctrine. And what I had just said was that it may seem in this kind of work that one is leaving practical life far behind. But I wanted to state that I always have the intention to take whatever may be learned in this very abstract area and return to the performance of practicalities, hopefully with a more illumined understanding and a greater capacity to serve all sentient beings. As you see here, I have an amusing little thing. I call this beings. By that I mean the great beings and the small. Such beings as the logos of the entire cosmos and his immediate subsidiaries, and then such tiny beings as the human being and the members of the lower kingdoms, and even the tiny little elemental lives, which are classed here as a lowercase b, beings. Anyway, we go on, beginning with the first fundamental of the secret doctrine. There is a boundless, immutable principle. It comes first, last, and always, and there are no real boundaries apparently outside it or inside it. I mean, to speak of inside and outside shows how concrete our minds are and how concrete our language is. So this is the very first, and I would say most important principle or fundamental of the secret doctrine. The fact that it, I capitalize these things when referring to the absolute. The fact that it, or this principle, and actually this should really be all in caps, is boundless, means that there is nothing other than it. It is the sole entity or life that simply is. I don't want to say the sole life of cosmos, because cosmos is simply a special case of this maximally great being or beingness. So there's nothing other than it. It is the one without a second one. There is none other. For the existence of anything other would necessitate a kind of location or bounded condition or space where it, the boundless immutable principle, was not, could not penetrate, could not permeate. There would be that other and the boundless immutable principle, and the boundless immutable principle, by whatever useless name we wish to call it, is the one and only. The cosmic logos is not the one and only. I mean, at least not in terms of how it is perceived. Nor is any other, when I say the cosmic logos, what I should say here is the universal logos. Cosmic logoi, as I've been defining them, are closer to home, such as the being in whom our solar logos is as a chakra. There are galactic logoi, supergalactic logoi, and all that. They are simply negligibilities, practically nothing, next to nothing, when compared with the infinite fullness of being of the boundless, immutable principle. So there is no place where it is not. Really, there's no place at all when you consider it. Time and space are not considerations when dealing with the boundless, immutable principle, because it is only what it is, ever as it is now. But perhaps we'll get a greater feeling for what that can mean as we go along. So we will have no space, location, condition, none of those things will exist in a primary sense, and there will be no space, location, or condition from which the boundless immutable principle can be excluded. We cannot say here is this and there is that. That is the dualistic state of mind which differentiates between this and that. And ultimately, there is no differentiation. So here is this infinity of infinities, this ultimate, this one and only ultimate being or beingness, and all other things, really, all other things that seem to be, because they are not really existent, all other things are essentially it. Though they appear to be other than it, it is only because we cannot detect it. And the kind of consciousness we have presents to us certain contents of consciousness, and this is the result of our limitation. Our limited consciousness presents certain contents of consciousness which appear to be other than it, but no thing included within the contents of consciousness, no thing presented to consciousness is essentially other than it, the boundless, immutable principle, which negates space and negates time. There would have to be something other if space or time were to exist. Since there is nothing other, space or time cannot exist. Time and space are dependent upon division, and as this essence, there is no division. The boundless immutable principle as essence has no essential division. It has maybe what we might call illusory division, a kind of apparent division which disguises its true nature from those from those points that are sent forth from the pointlessness. Of course, as DK tells us, it is beyond all thought. And let's see, maybe we can find this in the beginning of treatise on cosmic fire. I thought I included it here, but maybe not. Okay, we'll look at it this way: boundless, immutable, principle. I only need those words. There is one boundless, immutable principle, one absolute reality which antecedes, and I might say succeeds as well, all manifested condition being. Maybe there's another kind of being other than manifested condition being. It is beyond the range and reach of any human thought or expression. So I want to put that here. I have put it elsewhere. All right, this is the first fundamental of the secret doctrine, and I'll simply include it here for reference. And that is on page, it's the introductory remarks in Cosmic Fire, and it's on page 3. All right, TCF 3. So I go on to say here, and I somehow repudiate my own warning. I say it is futile to attempt to name this essentially nameless one. Of course, is it a 1 or is it a 0? Some people say it's a 0, but if it exists, if it is a reality, and if it is the only reality, our consciousness has no way to come to terms with it except to consider it as a 1, because a 0 is really a nothing. If we do not consider, even if we name the 0 a nothing, we have designated it as something, just in the act of naming. So this whole question about what the 0 really is has to be carefully thought. Within the 0, or as one cannot examine the 0, and we can only use a word like in. Within the 0, there are no things, and yet the potential for all things, all possible things, and maybe even the consummation forever of all possible combinations. Nothing can be added to it, nothing can be subtracted to it. Everything possible is foreseen. Now, some people will call this God or deity, but the absolute simply means no change to it whatsoever can occur. Okay, anyway, the boundless immutable principle, which is a fundamental one of the secret doctrine. So it is futile to attempt to name this essentially nameless one, but for practical purposes, you see, we have to talk about it, because when you talk about other things, those other things have to be held up in comparison to it. Otherwise, we cannot understand the fundamental negligibility of these other things. And of course, all we are presented with in cosmos is what we might call things, or perceptions, or registrations of unities and complexities, and unities which are the sum of complexities. That's what we are presented with. But to really understand them, this fundamental ground of all being, like the pedal tone in the Indian music, has at least to be acknowledged, even though, as DK says, it is beyond the range and reach of any human thought or expression. And as I've already expressed, I wonder whether it is beyond the reach of any thought or expression whatsoever. How far is the, well, paradox, really, absolutely. So I was asking, how far is this absolute being from even the universal logos? Well, the universal logos is that one being, and yet from the point of view of illusion, which reveals separate things, the ratio is as if absolute infinity to one. A oneness is created in a point. The relationship between absolute infinity and the point is something that one will want to speculate upon, and I will take this up. But there is an infinite gulf between any point, and maybe there's only one point ever, and what this great be-ness is. So I sometimes wonder, as I've wondered, whether any thing, such as a point, separated from the pointlessness, can ever fathom, in the state of pointness, what the pointlessness is. At this point, would you would you say all this is pointless to discuss? Anyway, the absolute, we can denominate it as the absolute, or I prefer the noun in a way, absoluteness, to give some idea of a state and to keep away from any anthropomorphism, such as God the Absolute. It's a kind of stateless state of absoluteness to which nothing, in which everything is foreseen, and to which nothing can be added or subtracted, and any possible combination or action is already accomplished in it forever. So I think what I'll do is put that down just as an orienting point. Let's just say this. If I can just find my cursor here, that any possible combination or pattern or state or action is already accomplished or fulfilled or consummated in it forever, or now as forever. Now as forever. Now as if it were forever, which it is. So you say, well, we're acting, and we seem to be creating new combinations, and in terms of time and space and the factors we have to work with, the energies and entities we have to work with, the combinations are new to that context, but they are not new to the absolutely infinite context of the absoluteness. So, it makes one ponder on the old saying, there is nothing new under the sun. if the Son were the absoluteness. Nothing new under the sun. So we are going to, for the sake of what type of consciousness it induces in our own consciousness, we're going to use different words for this nameless one. But remember, when you deal with a one, you pretty well deal with the idea of boundary. But this is the one without boundary, and so some have denominated it the zero. But when one denominates it as the zero, one may forget that it is absolute infinitude and contains the essence of all combinations forever enacted. The essence of all combinations forever consummated, enacted, etc. Well, you say, well, you know, what's the use? Why should we do anything? Well, it doesn't really have to do with improving our essential nature, because our essential nature cannot be improved. The infinity of all infinities is our essential nature, and to it nothing can be added or taken. And there's nothing possibly new within it whatsoever, or old. It's simply forever so, forever maximally so. We will say forever utterly so. This is our inherent, essential nature. So if we want to improve something, it's the illusion we have to improve. We have to archetypalize the illusion. We have to perfect the illusion according to the algorithm or the archetypal pattern that is the guiding force within any point. But more about the point to come. It's a good thing to have this great be-ness in mind and to contrast it with all that changes, all that transpires. It has been said the more things change, the more they remain the same, and this statement can be interpreted in terms of what we are saying here, that all things are it. The more things change, the more they remain the same. It's actually a fairly enigmatical statement. It doesn't mean that patterns are simply being repeated. All apparent change is nothing but sameness misinterpreted. Well, is that too bold a statement? All apparent change is not but sameness interpreted in the light of limitation. Okay, so other names, well, as I say in my infinitization book, I think there were 241 names. I just kept going, always with the hope that each name would evoke a different perspective on the part of the reader. Not that I really hope to capture the essence of what I was attempting to name. It was just a heuristic method, something to produce greater apprehension in those who might read the name and understand a little bit more about what it wasn't, as much as about what it might be. In a sense, about it, you could say that everything you could say about it is false, and everything you could say about it is true. That's quite a contradiction there. So all you can say about it is both false and true, as it is the fount of all possibility, or it is the, well, I'm thinking of new names here, well, I want to stress the idea that in, and I can't use a word like in because it's a spatial word, in it, all possibility is consummated forever. And of course, maybe this is a counterintuitive statement, because this means that everything that has ever been in terms of time and everything that ever will be in terms of time, no matter what it may be, is already consummated in it fully. Now, I'll have to trace out the implications of that kind of thinking. I'm not sure I emphasize that so much in the infinitization book. Can we do something new? Do we still have free will? Well, yes, within myopic limitation, we have what is called free will, but is what we do already done forever? That's quite a question. Has it already been done forever? Could anything that could ever be done, any act, we could say it this way, any possible act has been done forever in it. And then I want to add, right now, to add further paradox. But obviously, different states of consciousness have to be ours in order to get over the apparent illogic of what is being said. We have to see and apprehend from an entirely different altitude if any of this is to make sense, and every once in a while it can come upon us. That altitude, of course, in terms of initiation, it has to be a sustained altitude or point of tension. And then perhaps we can see. So another name which may be evocative of realization is, I like this word, the infinitessence. Well, you might say, well, why not just call it the infinite essence? But I thought might be nice to elide these words, the infinitessence, or the ultimatization, ultimate state of ultimatization, as just as far as it can go, and just as infinite as it can be. We're speaking of the essence, which is the very essence of all things, all possible things. So we have such words, such coined words, to try to evoke in us some sense of the absoluteness of this being, non-being, as it is called in the secret doctrine. Even there the paradox is brought forward, being, non-being. So this is the infinitessence, the ultimatization, and its essence is, another coined word here, infinitessentiality. This is the kind of stateless state in which it abides. Infinitessentiality. Difficult even to pronounce it. So a name for it can never be accurate, though some names may serve to change the human consciousness in such a way that it is, that what it is may be more fully, never fully, but more fully, well, I shouldn't say experienced here, I should say intimated, slightly understood. Now, is it important to think of this boundless, immutable principle, this absoluteness, this infinite infinitude, absolute infinity, this infinitessence, this ultimatization, this infinitessentiality? It just depends on the degree of our passion, if I can use such a human word, for reality, for suchness, for the indescribable essence. That's what it depends upon. Its essence is infinitessentiality. Okay. So I kind of have a trinity of terms that I've selected out of this, and every time I press a certain code word, they appear. But there is nothing but absoluteness, infinitessentiality, ultimatization, now. Speaking in terms of time, which is illusory, and forever. Well, now is more accurate, but now as ever, now and forever. That's when this is. Now as forever, now as ever. That's when this stateless state is, ever the same in being absolutely complete. So, ever the same in being absolutely complete. Now, everything about our life is based on incompleteness and on limitation. So we can only imagine relative completeness. A certain number of elements exist, and they are to be brought together in a certain arrangement, all of them summoned into some kind of gestalt, and then we say, it's complete. But that's only a relative completeness, and we can imagine nothing other than a relative completeness. But if we let the imagination really go, and we imagine the infinitizing of every infinity within it, or as it, we just get some idea of this incredible infinitization of the absolute. And I like the idea that everything you say of it is false and everything you say of it is true, because it contains all possibility. We can't call it good or bad. Good or bad are relative terms, and they have to do with the degree to which any archetype is fulfilled. Every universal logos who comes forth is a kind of an archetypal pattern, and must fulfill that pattern within its own self-contemplation, its own self-perception. But that is only a relative pattern, and though in this universe there will be the movement by all constituents towards the glory of universal logoic archetypal fulfillment, it's still infinitely removed from completeness in the absolute sense. Some people have described infinity as that which cannot be completed, but we are talking here outside of time and process and change. We are talking about an absolutization. Maybe I should add that word. Which is beyond any possible change, because all possibility is forever consummated in it forever now. So, these are abstract considerations, and they may mean different things to different people. I mean, when different people hear certain words, they have different meanings to the different people. All I can do is try to present them in terms of what they seem to mean to this limited point of being consciousness, this little emanation, little relatively, myself, what I conventionally call myself. I can just present the meaning as I seem to understand it and hope that some registration of my meaning will come across to others, or perhaps stimulate in them registrations which are still more intensely illumined than my original intention. So I postulate that nothing is but absoluteness, or should I call it absolutization, infinitessentiality, infinitessentialization, I suppose, ultimatization, giving the sense of something of that which is beyond anything. Now and forever, now as forever, now as ever. We can say nothing. What was that? Nothing but it. And that is so radically destructive of our usual state of mind, which values the many contents of consciousness and the great variety which seems to impinge upon our consciousness. Our world is a world of variety, and if we think about an absolute singularity, an absolute homogeneity, everything is wiped out. An absolute singularity. I don't think I'm using it in the same way as physicists use it in relation to the Big Bang. I'm using it in relation to one simple, utterly homogeneous being, non-being, infinitessence, which is the source of all its self-objectifications, which we usually identify as reality. So nothing is nothing that nothing is, or maybe I should add the word really is, but this, which in feeble words I attempt to somehow indicate. Not really describe, I suppose. How can one describe the infinity of all infinities? Just indicate, perhaps. So in order to express, I said first, now as and forever. That's what I said at first, now and forever. But then, as you see, I've modified this a bit. Now and forever should be expressed as now as forever, now as alwaysness, now as ever. And what I mean to say is that the now is forever. The forever is now. I mean, this is not an isolated now compared to other possible nows. This is the only now. So we are speaking of the only now, the one and only now, which seems a kind of contradiction, because the idea of now is that it is always preceded by a previous now and will be succeeded by a subsequent now. But this is the ongoing, all-absorbing now. Well, let me put it this way. The now which absorbs forever. It's an infinite now. It absorbs the infinite sequence of what we call moments. It absorbs, I mean, we could go backwards in time, a Googleplexion of universes. Those are numbers so big, you can't fathom them, and yet they are next to nothing compared to this timeless it. We could go back that far or forward that far, and the now would be the absorber of all of the infinitudinous events, actions, motions, patterns, which would be generated in those universes. This is a very powerful now. I never really studied, the book The Power of Now, and I saw the man who generated, he looked like he had a monastic past, I thought to myself. And I'm sure there's some very worthwhile ideas there about how to live in the now. I'm speaking of now a little more metaphysically as the absorber of infinite sequences. Now as the absorber of an infinite temporal sequence of universes. So it is, as I say, somewhat counterintuitive, because everything about our consciousness tells us that there's a past, present, and future. And I can only think that, I think love annihilates time. And we're also told in the 6 trumpeted phrases that being and time do not agree. I believe that being annihilates time. I'll say that, I want to have a I want to have a lowercase word. Being annihilates time, but here I will make this a lowercase word. Well, I think we can be being with one capital B and be being with all capital letters, which would be ultimate. But if we are the being of the universal logos, that's only with a one capital letter, and it too annihilates time, but it does not annihilate the time implied in the great breath. Because the archetype of all time and of all sequence is the great breath. So, in the present context in which we are speaking, now as ever means now as if now was ever forever the only real temporality, durationality, or now as everness. Well, that's the kind of thing that looks like nonsense, but let's look at it a little more closely. Now as ever means now, as if now was ever forever the only real temporality, durationality. It means that when I say now, I mean everness, or foreverness, even though the now I'm speaking of may be a cipher. Maybe the now, which is spoken of here, is a cipher with no duration. Now just imagine having a now with no duration. We normally think about, well, that happened now, this minute, this second, and there's a temporal duration there. There's a sort of a temporality, durationality in that tiny little segment of what we call time. It's measurable. The word Maya means that which can be measured. That's one of the meanings of Maya. So I was told. Maybe read it somewhere. It's stuck in my mind. But we are dealing with an immeasurable now. It is as if now is immeasurable. And I'll talk about that in a minute. It's dimensionless. And that even the, let's call it this, infinite temporal or durational sequence is itself immeasurable. And this is the amazing thing here, possibly. This infinite durational sequence of infinite universes occurs in no time at all. We might say instantly, but then an instant seems to have measurability. And we will shortly attempt to show that now has no measurability. Now has no measurability. As a matter of fact, we're going to show, well, indicate at least, suggest that there's no such thing as a unit of time. That there are no moments. There are many virtual moments. There are many seeming moments, many moments in illusion which have to be taken as actual and dealt with as if they were real, though they're only actual in illusion. I'm beginning to think that, Zeno and Parmenides, pre-Socratic philosophers, dealt with the idea of no movement. Paradoxes there, that in the midst of all this apparent change, there's no change at all. Maybe when I called the absolute the great paradox, it was not so far from true. I mean, if anything you say about it is both true and false, there is paradox, or at least that which cannot be grasped by the human mind as presently constituted. So then, what I'm saying here is that absoluteness, infinite essentiality, I like that other word a little more, but maybe I'm not going to, absolutization. Well, I won't torture the matter. Absoluteness will have to do. Absoluteness, infinite essentiality, ultimatization is the only reality. Now as forever, or now as ever. The only. Everything else, the Mahamaya, and yet not the Mahamaya, because the Mahamaya itself is absoluteness, infinite essentiality, ultimatization. So what is important to realize in a fundamental sense is that simple thought, that absoluteness, infinite essentiality, ultimatization is always the only reality, and I want to add, you know what I'm going to add? Now. The only reality now. Well, can you compare anything to itself? I use the word compared. We're always going to run into problems of language. And the fact that language has been created by a very dualistic and limited consciousness, and therefore reflects those limitations and that duality. But nevertheless, I say that compared to absoluteness, infinite essentiality, ultimatization, time is an illusion, but a seeming reality. I mean, we're not going to drop the illusion of the reality of time, or else we cannot live in that part of the absolute which is manifesting as the non-absolute. And in it we must live, and have always lived, will live forever, have lived forever. Isn't that strange? We've already lived forever, and we will live forever. It begins to jar upon the mind that something is strange. Forever has forever elapsed. Forever has forever elapsed. And yet, there's more in the foreverness, such are the paradoxes of infinity. So compared to this ultimatized state, and why don't I put that in, just kind of the ultimatized, absolutized, stateless state. Time is an illusion, but a myopic necessity. I'll put that in. But a myopic how about that? NECT, necessity. It's a seeming reality which is really an unreality, and space is also an illusion. Illusion, what is an illusion? It is any limitation of absolute consciousness is an illusion. So any limitation upon absolute consciousness is an illusion. Now, of course, I think there's something beyond what we might call absolute consciousness. I call it absolute being or beingness. I think consciousness is derivative of being, or from being, derives from being, derivative of being. But any limitation upon the absolute registration of it by itself is an illusion. So anything is an illusion. Anything less than the infinite being itself is an illusion. So I'll put this down. Anything less than the utterly infinite being itself is an illusion. The whole universe is an illusion. Because any one universe, unless they're all simultaneous, any one universe is simply the merest fragment of the infinite whole, and yet, because the infinite whole is indivisible, that fragment is the entirety of the whole, essentially. We just can't help but speak in such paradoxical terms, but if we continue to do so, it may do something to the mind which will break its conventional apprehension and allow in some greater registration of reality. Though it must be said that both time and space are, and here I use this word, actualities in consciousness. They are not realities, but they are things to be dealt with. They occur in illusion. They are actualities in consciousness, cyclically forever. When time is considered as real, are there really cycles? I've always thought there were cycles, and I've always thought of the great breath as inviolate. And in terms of consciousness, I think the great breath is inviolate. In terms of being, I'm not sure. Now, I think I'll put that down. Yep. In terms of consciousness, the great breath is inviolate. But in terms of being, perhaps not. Perhaps not. I mean, does it really occur? Is there this in-breathing and out-breathing, which occurs in time? Because the in-breathing and out-breathing has to occur in time. It is the greatest of all sequences with which we are presented, and there is measurement involved in it. 7 eternities of slumber, and maybe 7 eternities of manifestation, whatever an eternity is in that particular context. So there is measurement, and where there is measurement there is Maya, and where there is consciousness there is Maya. Let's put it that way. Where there is consciousness, there is Mahamaya, or simply Maya. The Mahamaya is the universe and all the infinitudinous sequence of universes which may be simultaneously occurring. As I said, some thoughts that are going beyond infinitization of selfhood and at least are more emphatically emphasized in this little sequence of points. So time is an illusion, but a seeming reality. Space is an illusion, also a mere seeming. Are there states which transcend time and space? Very definitely. Time and space are perceptions. They are categories of registration. Time and space are inseparable from consciousness, but being may also be separable from consciousness. So, time and space are inseparable from consciousness. Being may be separable from consciousness, if consciousness is derivative of being. You sometimes hear talk about absolute consciousness. I've even used that word here. But absolute consciousness must be being, perceiving the whole, the absolute infinitude of itself. So there's a difference here between being and seeing. Seeing is a reduction of being, as I understand it. And in this ultimatized, infinitized state, I don't think there's a question of consciousness. I think that being is maximally and infinitely intense, and there's no need for consciousness. Consciousness is absorbed in this infinitized beingness. So, going further, well, I wonder if we should go further. Maybe I'll pause just for a moment here. Okay, well, that was just a very little pause. So we're talking about actualities in consciousness, time and space occurring cyclically forever in the world of illusion. And what I'm suggesting is that when we think of the great breath and we talk about the great breath, the ultimate great breath, I guess all the lesser beings breathe in this way too, so they are illusions within illusions. When we talk about the great breath from this perspective, it is a great reality occurring in a beginningless, endless, infinite sequence. But when we think of it in terms of the boundless immutable principle, it perhaps does not exist in the same way that we usually conceive of it as existing. So one is the horizontal arm of the cross, it's infinite, and the other is the vertical arm of the cross. And probably what happens is that the two arms collapse into a point which disappears, into pointlessness, which is homogeneously exactly what it is now, forever. But those are just asserted statements, and I'll try to come to, well, they won't be proofs exactly, but I will try to offer some thoughts which will indicate why I'm saying these things. We can also say that every manner of possible distinction is also an illusion within this homogeneous continuum. And I think I'll also capitalize this. This homogeneous continuum of exactly what it is, the absoluteness, infinite essentiality, ultimatization. Distinction of any kind, and obviously even the great breath, is a distinction between on and off, between point, pointless, universe, no universe. So any possible distinction belongs to the category of actualities in consciousness or seemings. Change belongs to the category of seeming. To the category of seeming. Of course, it is eternal in its appearance, and it appears cyclically as far as consciousness is concerned. The question is it really appearing at all? Is anything really happening? Does the Mahamaya really exist, or does it seem to exist? I suppose there's a question of tracing all things to the fundamental infinitessential state, condition, well, you know. And perhaps that is the only abidingness. We might say that the infinitessential state is the only abidingness. So, in this sense, we might be able to say that nothing happens, and there's that word implying change and movement, but we're used to such a word. Is anything happening? Well, maybe nothing is happening. Nothing happens but absoluteness, infinitessentiality, ultimatization. And since the word happens implies change through time, it's not such a good choice. All that seems to happen is unreal per se, and I think I'll express unreal in this way: unreal per se, though actual in consciousness, and is essentially and unchangingly absoluteness, infinitessentiality, ultimatization. Ultimatization. So this is the only thing going on, and it's simply ongoing sameness, which is absoluteness. So we're dealing with ongoing sameness, which is as absolute as possible. So it's important then to grasp the contrast between the states to which we are habituated, like time and space, and the alternations which occur with the onset of time-space and its disappearance, onset, disappearance, and this otherness, which is everythingness, which has no time-space, no movement, no alternation, no interval, no cycle, just homogeneously what it is, the absolutization, forever, now. And those are two poles of thought which are very difficult to hold in relation to each other. Because they are ultimately contradictory. Change and changelessness abiding simultaneously. You would think they would be self-canceling. And yet the experience of consciousness is that there is change. And, well, being and time do not agree, we are told, but being and consciousness do not agree also. And we, in our relative state, have to live with that. That absolutized being and consciousness do not agree. And the agreement becomes even less when consciousness reveals not itself, but all the many movements, changes, activities, all the fluctuation born of number and division. Energized division is change. So in that state or stateless state of absoluteness, infinite essentiality, ultimatization, time is not and space is not. Really, they are not. Actually, in illusory actuality, they are. And this is the ongoing dichotomy that presents itself to us when we want to think about ultimate reality. And can we somehow, in all our limitation, contain this dichotomy? I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there are those who have managed better than we. But we have to live a practical life filled with time, deadlines, the clock, all the rest of it. Filled with going here and there in apparent space, in apparent extension, knowing somehow deep down that time is not and space is not really. And, so there's reality and the actuality, and we have to live both. Well, that's the ideal. We have to live both reality, well, maybe I should simply, reality and actuality. I guess it's a lot easier to live actuality. Maybe there's just no living to do in reality. What can we say? We have to be being reality, and actively live actuality. Now, most of us don't hold those poles in mind. We just don't have the capacity to hold this rending dichotomy in mind. Of course, essentially it's not a dichotomy, because finally absolute beingness swallows everything else. It is everything else. But in the Mahamaya, we are forced into the dichotomous state. At least those appear to be the limitations upon our consciousness at this time, though maybe somehow we are also completely being the being beneath it all. Only in our myopic state we don't realize it. And we have to bring our myopic consciousness to the point of realization. Because all that is, was, will be, or ever could be, okay, does that cover it all? Because all that is, was, will be, or ever could be, and that goes back endless universes ago and to come, is essentially absoluteness, infinite essentiality, ultimatization. Time and space are always unreal, though actual. And maybe if we could just get that principle into our consciousness, into our realization, we would have a different attitude towards those presentations we call time and space, those contents of consciousness we call time and space. Because all that is, was, will be, or ever could be is essentially absoluteness, infinite essentiality, ultimatization. Time and space are always unreal. No, they're unreal in the now, that's for sure. Though actual in terms of our ever-demanded myopic consciousness. There's no such thing as escaping from Maya. I think Shankara says that. Brahman and samsara, Maya, are eternal. He says so many things that you could just gloss over and say, oh yeah, I've heard that before, and then you really start to think about it. Maya is eternal. And we're never going to escape from it, except perhaps by realizing that it's not really Maya. The appearances which Maya provides have to be resolved into reality, so that naught remains, despite illusions, but the absolute infinitude, the absolute beingness. Naught remains. And in a sense, naught, it's true that even now, in our ignorant state, naught remains but that. And it may be so that there is some essence of us which even now knows that naught remains but that, even while this lesser projection of that greatness that we are is bewildered. So time and space are always unreal, though actual. Unreal, though actual. It looks like that should have hyphens in it, and maybe an abbreviation of its own, like this, UTA, unreal though actual. They are presentations to consciousness. I think Kant would have said they're categories of consciousness, or categories of mind, or categories of the human perceptual mechanism. Time and space are categories of consciousness, presentations to consciousness. As for the nature of consciousness and its derivation, I've hinted at this, but I would suggest studying infinitization of selfhood, because there I talk much about a state which transcends that of consciousness. And it is an infinitessential state. I can put that down. I can say let's say the state which transcends consciousness is the infinitessential state. Mostly inaccessible to us, well, probably utterly inaccessible, but one has intimations of infinite essentiality. Infinite essentiality. So all that seems to happen occurs in, can I use a word like in, with its connotation of location and division and boundary and so forth? What else will we say? All that seems to happen occurs in, maybe eventually I'll use the word as, in the forever immutable absoluteness, that is the forever unchanging, forever non-durational, forever self-identical, eternal now, in which one self-identical ultimate reality ever is as it is. I think that's an important sentence. It may be hard to grasp a little. Still, if we can get a general feeling for it, we may be on the way. All that seems to, quote, happen occurs, quote, in the forever immutable, well, it's really as, of course, the forever unchanging, forever non-durational. Imagine a non-durational now. It seems a contradiction. Forever non-durational, forever self-identical, eternal now, in which one self-identical ultimate reality, I mean, it's like nothing else. It is everything else, but it's like nothing else, in which one self-identical ultimate reality ever is as it is. All this in the non-durational eternal now. All this in the non-durational eternal now. I think there are moments in non-time when the full, infinitely intense beingness of this, realization of this, occurs. We could say it's when the point disappears, and if we allow a sequence, we could say it's when the point disappears and deity is again all in all. But in a sense, there is this continuity, continuousness of the one self-identical ultimate reality. So in a way, this realization is always occurring. The greatest intensity of self-knowing, intensity of self-being, and I want to say, well, I just want to leave it almost at self-being. Self-knowing is implied. Of self-being is continuously occurring. But there is no change in all of this. It's simply ongoing self-being, occurring in a non-durational now. Ongoing self-being, occurring, can't use that word really, but how to spell it, huh? Doesn't want to go down on the paper. That word doesn't want to go down. Occurring in the non-durational eternal now. Ongoing self-being occurring in the non-durational eternal now. There is but one eternal now, and it is ever exactly the same. Nothing added, nothing subtracted, ever possible. Indivisible and incapable of being multiplied. To name all of the arithmetic operations, there's but one eternal now and one identical self-identical ultimate reality, being in that eternal now, ever the same forever, ever the same. One eternal now is ever exactly the same. So we can say there's one self-identical ultimate reality being in the eternal now. Being what it is in the eternal now. So we can say this way, being in the eternal now. It seems so remote, doesn't it? It seems like one cannot grasp it. Well, maybe one cannot grasp what one is. Certainly, I think there are infinitudinous intensities of this realization or this beingness. We say, well, I am that, I am being that, but I would say there are infinitudinous states of being that, and only as that can one entirely have the infinite intensity of registration of that state. Everything else in the Mahamaya is a tiny proportion of that infinite intensity of registration. So we could say this, we seek an infinite intensity of registration of that. And we can say, and even now it is happening. So we're seeking what's already happening. I am the seeker and the sought. I rest in these paragraphs that Master D.K. gives us. He gives us a pretty good idea that what we're looking for is what we are. Well, that's a common idea. Of course, it has to be realized. So, being, absoluteness, being itself, eternally now. Being itself eternally. Or, well, maybe just like this. Being itself now. Being itself now. Well, that in a way, that's what we are, essentially. We are being itself now, forever. But I shouldn't even use a word like forever or ever. I should just use the word now, because now subsumes all foreverness, all everness. Now cannot succeed itself, and so there is no infinite sequence. Well, I think I'll get into that. But I'll say, since now cannot succeed itself, there is no infinite sequence. And then I'll just say, not really, but apparently. So I guess what I'm saying here is that all sequence is an apparency, registered by consciousness, which is a derivative of being. But obviously we have to translate these words into things that mean something in our illusory world, because we are forever going to deal with the Mahamaya. It's the habit of our selfhood to self-veil, to hide from itself, as it were, and rediscover itself. To hide and rediscover, the eternal game of peekaboo. So there is but one eternal now, and it is ever exactly the same. It is unmodified by the apparent movement of moments. Moments do not move. It requires change. It requires a distinction of moments for there to be a movement from moment to moment. But we are dealing with immeasurables. We're dealing with ciphers which cannot move. It is unmodified by the apparent movement of moments. It's unmodified by the change from one moment to the next moment, because there's no division in time. See, the now has no duration. A moment apparently has duration, but the now has no duration. Oh, that's no good. So let's see. I'll say this, that the moment has duration and measurability, but the now does not. And I'll try to get into showing why that might be so when I deal with the point. So the great sequence of appearing and disappearing universes presented in the second fundamental of the secret doctrine is to me anyway, a secondary reality related to myopic consciousness, though it is an experiential actuality. A secondary reality and an experiential actuality when compared to the primary reality of the first fundamental. So just repeating these. So we have them in mind, of what is primary and what is secondary. The first fundamental is given in the Treatise on Cosmic Fires as follows. Number one, there is one boundless, immutable principle. One absolute reality which antecedes, I would have to say succeeds too, but antecedes all manifested conditioned being. I guess he's careful not to say antecedes all being, because being, though not existence per se, is attributed to that. We oftentimes call it absolute being. There's one boundless, immutable principle, one absolute reality which antecedes all manifested conditioned being. It is, of course, here's where we should just stop and give up, right? It is beyond the range and reach of any human thought or expression. Does that mean that when we enter the fifth kingdom of nature we can think about it? Certainly we'll be tempted to think about it. But anyway, it's beyond the range and reach. I mean, we can't even deal with the one about whom naught may be said, who's not even a galactic being. So how do we deal with the being, non-being, to whom the entire collection of universes is as a single finite point? It is beyond the range and reach of any human thought or expression. The second fundamental is given in the same source, is as follows. I think HPB elaborates on this in the Secret Doctrine. There is a basic law called the law of periodicity. The Tibetan simplifies these when he presents them in Cosmic Fire. But as I've said, to me, this second law is secondary. It is something that consciousness can appreciate, but which does not agree with being. Let's see. So I would say this, that being and the second fundamental do not agree. He says being and time do not agree. Well, the archetype of time of, where is this? Okay, let's see here. Do not agree. Let's just say that the archetype of time is and space is found in the second fundamental. The great breath is the archetype of time, space. There are intervals, time. There is something other registered in consciousness, space. And of course, I have no doubt that the great breath occurs, and that from the perspective of the Mahamaya, there is interval between the exhalations and the universes, and duration of the universes. But from the perspective of the boundless, immutable principle, is anything happening? Maybe no thing is happening. Nothing's happening now. But from another perspective, no thing is happening now. And that, to me, seems the deeper reality, a bit monolithic and, well, you could say it's a bit boring, nothing's happening. But remember that from one perspective here, everything that ever could be, everything that was, will be, is forever consummated in that, and is occurring, well, is in the full state of expression in that now. In this infinite essentiality, every potential is fulfilled. Now some might say, well, the whole point is not that every potential should be already fulfilled forever, but that potential should keep going, keep manifesting, so that it would never be complete. Always something new would be occurring. It would not be the infinity of infinities. And that's one really to apply one's thought to. Is there the utter infinite completeness of that, to which nothing can be added or subtracted, and in relation to which no division or multiplication is possible? Is there that? Or is there something always new? Is there something new under the sun? My leaning, my inclination is to think of the ever consummated, of the forever consummated. And for the forever consummated now being. Not very good English, but maybe you can see what I'm driving at. Of course, that is where the counterintuitive formulation enters. It's pretty easy to think of always getting better and better and always doing new things and always going on and on in time according to cycles endlessly, but then there's also this entirely vertical dimension. In which God is, and absoluteness is. And that, that's very paradoxical, but something that we might want to begin thinking about as we perceive the world, or perceive what is presented to us. It's obviously beyond the range of the human mind. Galileo gave up on infinity when he took two concentric circles and drew an infinitude of radii, or at least conceived of them, touching every point on the circumference of that circle, only to discover that this infinitude was a lesser infinitude, an ever, ever, ever lesser infinitude in the next outer concentric circle, because there would be then spaces between the infinitude of radii. And hence what one deemed as infinity was not really infinity. There were lesser and greater infinities. I guess Cantor took that up and was much protested against by some opponents. It all depends how your mind is constituted, whether you want to get into these things or whether the more concrete perceptions are sufficient to satisfy your mental aspirations. Well, anyway, these are the two fundamentals, and I hierarchicalize them, saying, well, the first one really describes reality, and the second one describes a condition which allows for duality, is the archetype of time, and is appreciated by a limited perceiving consciousness. It sort of makes time eternal in endless duration. But maybe time does not exist, and so interval cannot exist, and everything, not only everything that could ever be, not everything that's conventionally happening is happening now, but everything that ever did happen and could happen is happening now, allowing that the word happening, of course, is not suitable to a non-durational now, which contains all infinite sequence. So all sequence, from my point of view then here, that I'm trying to describe and which I've begun to think about, is a seeming and an actuality in consciousness, and thus essentially, and maybe I should just, essentially an illusion, something untrue from the ultimate perspective, something untrue from the ultimate perspective. So we seem to be placing the Saturnian truth in a secondary position to the Uranian truth, coming way, way down here in the universe. These two beings somehow represent for us simultaneity and sequence. And we might say that Saturn is derivative of Uranus. And maybe that's also so in terms of the cosmogony, with Uranus being the most ancient, Saturn being derivative. Now, forever, as we think of the concept of forever, we will be dealing with sequence. The great breath is not an unreality, it's a great reality in the Mahamaya. It's an actualization in the Mahamaya. It is how things seem to be when consciousness perceives them. But in the ultimate beingness, which the first fundamental suggests, Are things that way? Is there movement? Is there change? Is there measurement? Is there sequence? Is there cycle? I challenge us and myself to think more deeply about this. So sequence is actual but untrue ultimately. Maybe I'll have some reasons for saying that. The eternal now transcends what, under the spell of time, we call eternal duration. Well, eternal duration, you know, forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever, without beginning, without an end. And the eternal now collapses all that everness, because eternal duration is conceived in a way under the spell of time. You wouldn't know something existed eternally unless you measured it against something else. There'd be no comparison which would reveal to you duration. But since there is nothing else, we simply say that this homogeneous something lasts forever. We might as well say it exists, it is eternally now. So I'm giving kind of a higher priority to the eternal now than to our usual conceptions of eternal duration. Forever and ever and ever. I remember when I was a kid, I used to want to see if I could write numbers to infinity. I think my parents got really tired of it, you know, but I would spend the whole day writing numbers. Just seeing how high I could go. I think I always ended up somewhere in the thousands. I couldn't do too much. But the idea of foreverness was really in my mind, at least from a starting point. But now as forever, now as ever, conceiving now as foreverness, conceiving now as everness, and convinced of the immovability of now, the non-changeability of that now, regardless of all the apparent change. Now changes not. Things seem to change, and now changes not. Change and move, yet now, well, how shall I do this? Now changes not. So eternal duration is, in reality, unmeasurable, because duration can only be discussed in relation to change and in relation to other things. And essentially there is never any change with regard to the boundless, immutable, indivisible principle. It reminds me of this rocket ship, which used to be an example in some of the attempts to explain relativity, that if the rocket ship is moving without any friction, you can't tell it's moving. So this is related to how to measure eternal duration. If there's nothing else, there's nothing against which it can be measured. Because you have to say, well, non-eternal duration. Measure eternal duration against non-eternal duration. But there isn't anything like that against which to measure eternal duration. So it might as well be now. And I'll put that in a colloquial sense. Eternal duration might as well be now. And I'm going to hypothesize that it is, which is not the same as fully realizing that it is, and certainly not any kind of infinitely intense realization. I'd be happy with just some little realizations here. now and then. You see what our language does. When we try to deal with these ideas which are beyond the capacity of our language to express. So the eternal now, I'm saying, is something still more fundamental than eternal duration, and that much harder to understand. Ongoingness, up to a point, is understandable. But that ongoingness is the same as a non-durational now, that's harder to understand. Hard to understand. Ongoingness as the same as a durational now. In my infinitization book, I categorized 3 different kinds of nows. The ordinary momentary now, and the kind of now that could be measured in universe, with a capital N, and then the full now, which had to do with the state of ultimateness. I'll have to review that. Probably I would modify it somewhat if I did. But I wanted to see, in a way, there's a kind of eternal now for each universe. But when you collect all the different universes together, you have to speak in terms of the absolute now, which is really the only eternal now. So eternal duration, I'm saying, is in reality unmeasurable because duration can only be discussed in relation to change. Eternal duration in reality, that is, with respect to the ultimate perspective, is in reality unmeasurable because duration can only be discussed in relation to change. And essentially not apparently, but essentially, there is never any change with regard to the boundless immutable principle. The absoluteness, infinite essentiality, the ultimatization, never any change. Change, as we experience it, is a presentation to consciousness, but not a reality. There is but one reality, and it is ever the same, now as forever, now as ever. Maybe we're beginning to grasp just a little bit of the feeling of these words, even if they don't make complete sense to us always. So maybe we need not to think so much in terms of gazillions of universes, the Googleplexian of universes, which is the largest number that has been named, one with a Googleplex zeros after it, but maybe in terms of this elusive eternal now. It seems important. There is a peace which passeth understanding. It abides in the hearts of those who live in the eternal now. Perhaps. Living in the eternal might seem to be living in the realization of infinite sequence, but I suggest that taking it a step further, it abides in the hearts of those who live in the eternal now. So I think it is important when it comes to spiritual development to have some sense of this eternal now. So sequence, therefore, is, let's call it unreal, though seemingly real. In relation to reality, there is never any sequence. To speak in terms which are not accurate but may be evocative, somewhat evocative, of realization, I will say then that absoluteness, infinite essentiality, ultimatization precedes and succeeds only itself. Well, if something succeeds itself, there is no real change, provided that the something that succeeds is exactly the same as that which is succeeding, and the something that precedes is exactly the same as that which succeeded it. It's like something with no boundaries succeeding itself. You couldn't tell that there's any change, and there isn't. As it is ever the same, sameness precedes and succeeds sameness, and there is no real change, though according to the second fundamental of the secret doctrine, beginningless, endless cyclic change in the form of the great breath occurs forever. So you see the contrast here between these two different kinds of thoughts. Continuity of sameness versus alternation forever. So the contrast, let's just say, okay, the contrast between continuity of sameness and beginningless, endless, cyclic change in the form of the great breath forever. So I think it would be better just to copy that and put it in red rather than try to type out that whole thing. And that's a very great contrast. No movement, just continuously exactly what it is, compared to beginningless, endless, cyclic change in the form of the great breath, which occurs forever, and has occurred already forever. So one is, I think what we're dealing with, and this strikes me, and I hope I get this down. We are dealing with duration as extensive, the analog to space having extension, and on the other hand, we're dealing with the never extensive, never temporally extensive now. This is the great contrast. So even the great breath is based on perpetual mutability and is thus ultimately the greatest and most magnificent of illusions. Maybe the highest of illusions. The second fundamental of the secret doctrine, the highest of illusions when compared to that which is revealed as the one and only. Though producing all we know of actuality, appearance based on apparent action. I'm defining actuality that way. So then every universe is apparently a cyclic, illusory occurrence when compared to the ultimatization. So essentially this occurrence is a seeming in consciousness and not a reality. And so I finally wound up with some sort of little code word here. I like these abbreviations. Nibbana. Nibbana is always true. True in this sense. Nothing but absoluteness now. That's the summing up of all that has been thus far said. We're about a third of the way through this paper. And, so a few more hours on it, anyway. But finally, considering that all we view in the world of change as illusory, including the great archetype of change, which is the great breath, we come to a more radical conclusion that essentially, as the infinite essentiality, being itself, there is nothing but absoluteness now. And yet, of course, the absoluteness is not only all things that have ever been, but all things that ever will be, speaking in terms of time. Nothing but absoluteness now. And maybe what we'll do is we'll end there, this one. So this is, we'll call it simultaneity and sequence 2. And it's about 2 hours long. And what is our day here? 13th of February 14th. And we'll begin with 3. With S and S, number 3. Well, you know, it takes some getting used to this terminology. I should be somewhat used to it. I've been evolving it, trying to find ways to speak about ideas that come to me and yet are hard to express. So I try to think of these things. It's much harder in a way to get this range of thoughts to relate to anything that goes on in the myopic world. And yet that bridging is my intention. It's often very frustrating. But it is my intention to bring these thoughts about non-durationality, the non-durational ultimate beingness in the non-durational eternal now, to bring them into relation with extension in time and extension in space. So, you know, I might say how to bring this kind of thinking into relation with a world characterized by extension in time and extension in space. Well, space really considered as extension, and time as the extension of moments, or the succession of moments. How to bring these kinds of thoughts into relation. See, time as the sequence of perceived moments and their endless extension. Backwards, apparently, and forwards. Well, we're used to those kinds of ideas. And we're used to the idea that when there's space, there's always the illusion of expanse, of extension. But we're not used to collapsing time and space as if it were practical or real or anything but an exercise in the mind. And yet I dare say that the higher souls live in a condition of space-time collapsed. Into what? Into what? Into a point. Pretty soon I'm going to get to that discussion of points, which really is maybe the most enigmatic kind of thinking that I've encountered. Pretty soon. In time. Now. Okay. Okay, friends, that'll be it for number 2, and I'll see you when I have a chance to deal with this next. We have a full moon going on tonight. No, not full moon, but a pre-full moon webinar, so I'll have to adjust my thought. and take this up as soon as I can. Again. Okay. Talk to you before long. Bye-bye.